Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is John Sitilides, and I serve as chairman of the Board of Advisors here at the Southeast Europe Project. And it is a genuine pleasure to welcome all of you here today for this collaborative effort of leading policy and research institutions here in the United States and in Europe. Here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Southeast Europe Project was proud to collaborate with our colleagues at the Kennan Institute, the East Europe Studies Program, and the West Europe Studies Program. We have a collaborative relationship, of course, with the Johns Hopkins University Center for Transatlantic Studies. Its director, Dan Hamilton, is not here, and we're hoping that his health... Hey, how are you, Dan? I didn't see you. How are you feeling? Wonderful to have you here. And so we work closely with Dan and his group and with Tato Japaridze with the International Center for Black Sea Studies. And so Dan and Tato, thank you very much for the efforts of your staff and colleagues to help bring this conference to fruition. Thanks, of course, are also due to the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation and the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. And a thank you, of course, to Ambassador Eva Nowotny of the Embassy of Austria for their valuable support. To Dr. Ruby Gropis, who is a research fellow at ELIAMEP, the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. Dr. Gropis is also a former policy scholar with us here at the Southeast Europe Project. And it was her concept paper that secured the federal funding to make this conference a reality. And to Andriy Peros, who's the program specialist here at the Southeast Europe Project, who structured and organized this conference in conjunction with our collaborators. Thank you very much. This conference has been conceived and organized to assess current geopolitical, economic, and state-building trends and developments in the Black Sea region, and to identify priorities and challenges for the United States and the European Union to be addressed through cohesive and coordinated approaches and targeted policies, rather than through the bilateral channels, as has largely been the case to date. Now, the wider Black Sea region has been marked as a pivotal strategic theater, Europe's new southeastern border, one might say, marked by new energy corridors and alternative pipelines, trafficking and other major criminal enterprise activities, radical Islamist networks, political destabilization, unresolved conflicts in Georgia, in Moldova, in Azerbaijan, intra-alliance tensions, especially in Bucharest, and new NATO bases now adjoining the crossroads of Eurasia. And so the region's importance has in many ways grown with the recent enlargement as well of NATO and the European Union into the Black Sea itself through the memberships of Bulgaria and Romania. The EU's growing energy dependence on Russia, whose global leadership in crude oil production has not eased its perception that the West is perhaps less of a partner than a strategic rival in Moscow's, what it considers to be, sphere of influence, will greatly complicate Europe's policy options in the years to come. And taken together with Turkey's increased naval power projection, the need in the West is perhaps greater than ever to cooperate in ensuring secure and steady energy supplies, to manage these regional conflicts, to promote liberal political institutions, and to build barriers against transnational and transregional threats such as organized crime and radical Islamism. So as long as the Black Sea region remains politically unstable, economically unbalanced, and culturally heterogeneous, the United States and the European Union will seek ways to help build durable political, economic, and security institutions, and to help harmonize the values and interests of Black Sea littoral countries and regional partners with those of liberal, democratic, free market countries and regional, transatlantic, and international institutions and organizations. And today, we intend for this conference to produce new ideas and to explore existing ones and to test them to help policy planners in Washington and in Brussels help achieve these strategic objectives. So thank you very much. It's my pleasure now to introduce one of our colleagues, Dan Hamilton of the Center for Transatlantic Studies. Dan, please.
Thank you, John. I'm sorry I was late. I've had a bad transatlantic flight. We're delighted to sponsor this with the Wilson Center and with our other colleagues here. This is the culmination on our side of a 2-year project that's resulted in 2 books, one called The New Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova, which we published last year with the support of the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation, and just finishing our second book now, The Wider Black Sea Region, and copies of that book are in the back if you'd like to pick them up. We have a collection of authors, European and American, and I think you'll find the essays in there reflective of the diversity of opinion about this region. We have 3 Russian authors that present, I think, some differing views than one often sees in English. We have some perspectives from the region as well as American and other views. So we'll explore that with some of our authors today. And as I said, look forward to this. I'd like to ask Wolfgang Stoiber from the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation to just say hello, since he's a great partner for us, and then we'll go on to the other greetings. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm very thank you. I want to say thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting the conference in here, and really feel honored to take part. I just want to say something on our foundation. As we know, geographers will say that America and Europe are drifting apart, but that's just the geographic dimension, and we know that on the political and economic side, it's just the opposite. And Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation would like to strengthen our relations and improve our common understanding even more, as it still exists. We do so by financing academic exchange, both students and professors, and by organizing common projects, as we do now with Center of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University. And I want to thank Dan for his input, scientific input, in the project and in the 2 books. And I want to thank Katrin Mays and Gretchen Lucy for the administrative work they have done and their engagement to the project. Austrian Marshall Plan's first idea was to look at the Ukraine, which the west border of the Ukraine is far nearer to Vienna as the far west of Austria is. So it's just 300 miles away. And Austria's industry had kind of great success in going to Central and Eastern Europe and using the economic growth, great economic growth and development in these countries. Dan suggested to go to the Caucasus region in the second step, and I was a little bit skeptic about it and said, well, another wild mountainous region, and sorry, and so we started our conference on the Caucasus in Tbilisi, and so we all could see how things are going and how the development is, and great development in the center of Tbilisi and the status of the country around. Very interesting country, and I would say the geographers are still wrong. It's not Asia, it's Europe. And they're European people, and they're thinking in the way we do. So here we are. We went to Vienna and to Brussels, and finally we've come to Washington to present our book and launch it. And thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Tito?
Yeah.
Good morning. I'm Tato Japaridze, alternate Director General of the International Center for Black Sea Studies, based in Athens. It's so good to be back home. I look at my good friend Blair Rubel. I spent the most fascinating 5 months upstairs at the Cannon Institute, and during these 5 months we worked, hard. I tortured a bit, Steph, with my Black Sea obsession, and I tried, just to promote, in my opinion, the great, very dynamic, sometimes too much, vibrant, region, and make it sort of the one of the central focuses of American policymakers here in Washington. So there is no doubt that the region is really very dynamic. We in the region still argue about among ourselves what we are. We are arguing about geography. Are we, a region? Is it a space? Is it a strategic corridor? A lot of things are going on in the region. As I say always, a lot of public goods, public bets going through. The energy projects, of course, these are fascinating, developments, but there are a lot of bad things going on in the region, illicit trafficking of all kinds. So in this regard, I think it's even a bit late for American policymakers. I'm not speaking about experts, because I'm looking at Jan Lesser, who is so well known in the world as one of the best experts on the Black Sea issues, but we need American policymakers as well, European policymakers, more productively and more, let's say, be engaged in this area on a practical manner. So a couple of words about our center. It's really unique center. We'll celebrate 10-year anniversary just in June. We are working on different, our agenda is quite broad. We are working on different issues: energy security, which I already mentioned, soft security, hard security issues. We try, and who following the events in the organization of the Black Sea Economic Cooperation, BSEC, that we insiders still fighting with each other how to converge, security and economic development issues. There are some member states who consider that these are two different, separate issues. We try to persuade them that these are just two issues or two sides of one and the same coin. So, of course, this conference is there's no doubt for me, would be very interesting, and there's a lot of questions to find some appropriate answers. And I wish all the best to the organizers. Of course, I'm very grateful to organizers, co-organizers, Woodrow Wilson, Transatlantic Relations, Austrian Institute for International Relations, Johns Hopkins University, all co-organizers, and of course, Her Excellency, Madam Ambassador Novotny, who was so kind to help and assist us. And thank you very much, and it's so good to be back, to this wonderful place.
Thank you, Tito, and thank you, Dan and Wolfgang. Why don't we convene the first panel, and we'll get started right away. I'll ask all the panelists to please join me.
I can just sit here. That's easy. Yeah. All right. Nice.
Well, normally the moderator will lay out a brief summary as to the purpose of that particular panel, but since I was given the privilege of offering opening remarks, I think I've encapsulated pretty much what I look for both in this panel and in the larger conference. So I don't want to be redundant. I think we're here to listen to the pronouncements of my four distinguished colleagues. So why don't we begin with panel one right away. This panel, of course, will focus on geopolitics and regional security concerns in the wider Black Sea region. And our first panelist is Professor Charles King. Charles King is chairman of faculty at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He's a professor of Romanian Studies and a professor of International Affairs and Government at Georgetown. And he has just published a widely acclaimed book The Ghost of Freedom, A History of the Caucasus. Professor King, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Great. Thanks very much indeed. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and to share some space with a really distinguished panel of experts on this on the wider region. It's not often anymore, I think, that one gets to begin a talk with Karl Marx, especially about this part of the world. But you will recall that Marx, when asked by Friedrich Engels what he thought the two most important events in Europe in his lifetime were, Marx replied that one was the suppression of the Polish rebellion in 1830. The second one was the suppression of what Marx called the Circassian Rebellion in 1864. I bring this up simply to point out Marx's view of what Europe was. Europe included Poland, and Europe included also Circassia, that is to say the northeastern coastland of the Black Sea, the northwestern portion of the Caucasus. It's worth recalling that our debates over the course of the 1990s and the early 2000s about what Europe is and whether the Black Sea is a part of it, whether the Caucasus are a part of it, the degree in the early 1990s about whether the Balkans are even part of Europe or not, and now ongoing debates about Turkey's relationship with the European Union. Many of these debates, in fact, were settled in the 19th century. That is to say, the Black Sea, for various parts of the 19th century, was thought of as every bit as much a part of Europe as what we now call Central Europe. It was a European space. It was a space that impinged on the interests of Europe's great powers, and the fate of this region in the 19th and early 20th centuries, actually, was very much a part of European strategy and European politics. The degree to which the Black Sea is, has been, will be, can possibly be a part of Europe is a debate that over the long stretch of history, it seems to me, has moved in a kind of sine wave. In various stages, we've thought of the Black Sea world as being the far edge of Europe. For the ancient Greeks, the far edge of the world, in fact, if you read your Herodotus. At other stages, however, and I would say the sine wave, that sort of the crest of the wave that lasts from, say, the end of the 18th century through much of the 19th century, the Black Sea was very much a part of European debates and European strategic thinking. We learned over the course of the 20th century and during the Cold War to think of the Black Sea as a borderland between East and West, between capitalism and communism, between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, between Europe and Asia, et cetera, et cetera. But that is a relatively recent, in terms of these sine waves, a relatively recent way of thinking about the Black Sea. And I think we're actually now, in our debates and discussions about the role of the Black Sea in the wider Europe, we're returning to a more 19th century conception of what Europe's boundaries actually are. And I'll leave it to you to decide whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's certainly worth observing. On the question of Black Sea regionalism, this also has a history to it. The emergence of Black Sea economic cooperation as an idea in the early 1990s, its escalation of debates and discussions about the Black Sea as a region throughout the 1990s, and the creation of the Black Sea Economic Cooperation Organization as an actual organization in the late 1990s, has a prehistory to it. One can go back all the way to the 1770s, I suppose, with the emergence of trade in the Black Sea that involved Russian-flagged commercial vessels from the famous Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca in 1774, the first time when Russian-flagged European commercial vessels were allowed to move freely into and out of the Black Sea in the modern period. And after that, there have been repeated projects for creating a kind of region around the Black Sea, all the way up through the interwar period in the 20th century and so forth. This, again, is something that is not completely new in the post-Cold War period. Those earlier projects, though, had sort of structurally two components to them, it seems to me, from the end of the 18th century forward. One was the competitive project to limit the influence of one or another empire around the Black Sea. The attempt by the Russian Empire to limit the influence of the Ottoman Empire, the attempt by the European great powers to limit the influence of the Russian Empire, and so forth. The many conflicts around the Black Sea from the end of the 18th century through the wars of the 1820s to the Crimean War in the 1850s to the Russo-Turkish War of the 1870s, all of these were about the jockeying for power among imperial rivals around the Black Sea. The second structural element, I think, is the attempt by one or another imperial rival to use the peoples around the Black Sea for purpose number one. It was sometimes called the liberation of the small peoples living around the Black Sea, the liberation during the period of the Cold War of the captive nations, which is a phrase you may remember, around the Black Sea and across Eurasia, but the attempt to use local nationalism as a way of countering an imperial rival. That is the historical context, I think. The idea of regionalism today is rather different in structural terms, and here is where I think history as a guide to contemporary affairs probably peters out. First of all, we're talking about states around the Black Sea today, no longer empires. States that in structural terms in the international system are structurally the same, have the same kinds of rights and responsibilities toward each other and toward other states. We're not talking about empires and nation states, different kinds of entities around the sea. Secondly, the United States now plays a critical role in this region. The United States has long had, of course, a presence in one form or another, whether it's sending warships through the Bosphorus to demonstrate freedom of the seas during the period of the Cold War, or if you'll recall from the 1920s, had the Treaty of Sèvres ever been fully implemented, the United States would have been the mandate power for Greater Armenia. But for a whole variety of reasons, the United States now is active in the Black Sea world in the way that it has not been historically. And third, the very real important European aspirations of the nation states, most of the nation states, I would say, around the Black Sea, to become not only a part of Europe in a kind of fuzzy cultural sense, but also a part of Europe in terms of membership in the European Union and the other defining international organizations of the Euro-Atlantic space. There are lots of ways in which regionalism around the Black Sea is talked about these days. We talk about expanding the zone of democracy, anchoring the relatively new states around the Black Sea in a system of regional and sub-regional and trans-regional organizations and institutions. We talk about promoting stability, opening markets, ensuring the flow of energy from east to west. But what does regionalism look like now, and how are we to think about it as we move further into the 21st century? Let me very briefly just make 4 points with regard to what I think the future of Black Sea regionalism looks like and how we're moving into a period that may be rather different from what we've experienced before. First of all, we are moving into a different form of regionalism, it seems to me now, because of the failure of the earlier form of regionalism in the early 1990s. Black Sea economic cooperation as an idea was an inspired idea, one inspired by the late Turgut Özal, the former president of Turkey, a visionary idea of bringing together all the countries around the sea and actually using geography as a way of defining membership in a particular region, an inspired and timely idea in the early 1990s at the end of the Cold War and the end of communism. But it was very much a product of the period in which it arose. That particular vision of the Black Sea came about, it seems to me, because of a great deal of regional institutional uncertainty in the wider Southeast Europe. Was the European Union ever going to admit countries that touched on the Black Sea? In the early 1990s, you'll recall that was a very uncertain idea. Could the Balkans ever be considered a part of Europe? A very uncertain prospect in the early 1990s. The countries around the sea, whether they were newly liberated countries in the case of Romania and Bulgaria, or newly independent countries in the case of a place like Georgia or Ukraine, were seeking membership in virtually any organization that would have them. And for that reason, Black Sea, as an idea, was very, very attractive. But there were plenty of others, too. You will recall the incredible alphabet soup of the 1990s as one or another group of countries throughout Central and Eastern Europe created a whole variety of different kinds of acronymic organizations that they could claim membership in, no one being really any more important than the other, because membership in any organization underscored the sovereignty and independence of the states of the region. It also came about because, as I mentioned earlier, of a particular vision on Turkey's part, that after the end of communism, after the end of the Cold War, the creation of 15 new countries in Eurasia, conflict very near Turkey's borders, whether in the Caucasus or in the Balkans, Turkey now had a new regional vocation. And it would play that role by reaching out to these newly independent countries, underscoring the Turkic heritage of some of them, crafting a vision of Turkey as a kind of regional leader. It seems to me over time that that particular vision has declined as well, in part because Turkey has been busy with other kinds of things, domestic reform and so forth, in part because the receiving countries were far less enthusiastic about Turkey's role as a regional leader than perhaps the Turks in the early 1990s had believed. Thanks. So I think the nature of regionalism today lies on that history of change, and one might even say the history of the failure of the particular vision in the early 90s. Secondly, in the late 90s and early 2000s, the historic, it seems to me, rapprochement between Turkey and Russia as regional players in the Black Sea has changed the dynamic profoundly in the region. If there is one historical constant over the last several centuries, it has been Turkish-Russian rivalry around the Black Sea, defining in many ways the conflicts of the 18th and 19th centuries, the zones of influence, the lines that were drawn in many cases directly across the sea itself. That is now beginning to change for a whole variety of reasons that many of you are familiar with. The commonality of interests in some areas when it comes to the politics of energy, commonalities of interest when it comes to exports, imports, construction, and a whole variety of economic linkages that now tie Turkey and Russia together. And perhaps most importantly, over the last 8 years, it seems to me, the nature of U.S. strategy, not only in the region but globally, which has carved out a completely respectable space for people to be non-aligned again. It was hard to be non-aligned in the 1990s with the triumph of a particular way of seeing economics, democracy, and so forth. It's much easier now in the wake of Iraq to be non-aligned. Third point, and I only have 4, and I'll wrap it up then. There is a growing space, I do believe a growing space between the United States and the European Union over the region's future. There is daylight between the U.S. and the EU when it comes to the nature of the Black Sea region, when it comes to issues such as Turkey and the European Union, a far more enthusiastic United States about eventual Turkish membership, a still uncertain at best European Union. A far more enthusiastic United States when it comes to questions of enlarging NATO, and enlarging NATO rather quickly to include Georgia and Ukraine. A more reticence on the part of the European powers when it comes to this question. Final point is, and this is again the ways in which the past is not the present. The Black Sea is a region in which, for all our talk about new security threats, from trafficking to energy security to drugs and thugs and so forth, that the Black Sea region faces, the Black Sea is an area in which the old security threats are still very much alive. The old security threats that we thought we had gotten over in other parts of Europe are still there. By those I mean questions about where borders lie, questions about what sovereignty means in this regional subsystem, questions about the role of minorities and how one defines what the nation is. Those are the key questions that it seems to me any project for regionalism is going to have to address. The irony and perhaps the difficulty is that historically regional or sub-regional organizations have been particularly bad at addressing those old security threats. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Charles. Our second panelist is Rasa Ostraskaite, and Rasa is the advisor for the Southern Caucasus of the Policy Unit of the Council of the European Union. Thank you very much, Rasa.
I'm delighted to be able to speak to you this morning, and I'm very grateful to the organizers for inviting me. Recent debate on the Black Sea regional security complex highlights the intersection of two competing logics. On the one hand, you have the geopolitical logic, and on the other, institutionalist. If the region is approached through the lenses of geopolitical logic, it becomes, as one commentator nicely put it, a platform for power projection to the Middle East and Asia, and a buffer zone for asymmetric threats to European security. Now, my presentation will clearly show a bias towards institutionalist logic, which itself is an outcome of recent EU enlargement. Now, the first question I ask is, how does EU see the Black Sea region? And I'd like to begin by referring to the European security strategy. The document itself was adopted some 5 years ago and is currently under review by member states. But I think it's still very relevant. Yes, new threats have been identified. The world has become more complex. But the unresolved tension between EU's global ambitions and at the same time understanding and recognition that geography does matter continues to manifest itself in a rather strong focus by Brussels on the area surrounding, on this physical space surrounding the Union. So by the time the EU came to the Black Sea shores following the latest round of enlargement, EU not only had a clearly spelled out objective, and that is to have a ring of well-governed countries established to the east of the Union, as it was spelled out in the European security strategy, but also attempted to answer the question of how to address this objective, meaning how to establish this ring of friends or well-governed countries. And the answer came in the form of the European Neighbourhood Policy. This policy tried to address three objectives. Number one is to promote stability, especially political stability and security to the east of the European Union. The second objective was to combat the so-called soft security threats, which were seen as either originating or transiting through the neighboring countries: organized crime, drugs, illegal immigration. And the last objective that the EU tried to address is to export some of the benefits from EU's enlargement so as to avoid the creation of new dividing lines. Now, there are two caveats to this European neighborhood policy. Turkey and Russia are not covered, although they happen to be to the so-called east from the EU, and they are neighbors. Turkey is not covered because Turkey has a membership perspective and therefore pursues a different track. And Russia decided not to be covered than once was consulted on the ENP. So in a way, the EU does not have an overarching umbrella policy framework for the region. It has three parallel policies. Now, what kind of conclusions can be drawn from these parallel policies that EU applies towards the region? The first conclusion is that EU has significantly upgraded its engagement, especially since the latest two rounds of enlargement. For the moment, the EU has earmarked some 12 billion euros for the neighborhood policies. The new developed tools such as the so-called ESDP operations, European Security and Defense Policy operations, have been dispatched to the region. The first rule of law mission was sent to Georgia, border assistance mission to Moldova. The EUSRs, or EU special representatives, were also appointed for the region, one for the Southern Caucasus and the second one for Moldova. But then it comes to one of the key challenges of the region, that means the so-called frozen conflicts. They do remain unresolved, and despite the fact that the EU has upgraded its engagement, EU still has no formal place at the negotiating table. That means EU does not have any role in the negotiating formats which were established to bring about the peaceful resolution for the conflicts in Southern Caucasus. Now, the second conclusion that could be drawn from this engagement is that the Black Sea countries are extremely heterogeneous and thus very different from the previous accession countries. And I come from Lithuania, so I mean a new member state. So one of the reasons that could be drawn is that these new countries, or the Black Sea partner countries, they do start out at a much lower level of development, and by that I mean either rule of law, democracy, or economy. So the challenge for the EU is much greater than it was in the accession countries. It's even more so because they do not enjoy the clearly spelled out European perspective, and that means the magnetic pull is not present there. The tools are also much weaker because the financial incentive is not there. It's there, but it's not as is modest in comparison to what was provided for the previous accession countries. And even more so, the political or domestic competition, which was extremely present and one of the key factors in explaining the success of the EU's enlargement policy. And by domestic competition, I mean either multi-party competition within countries or between countries. Who's going to join the EU first, as it was in the previous rounds of enlargement? That is only weakly present in the new in the neighbourhood policy countries. Now, another conclusion that could be drawn is that European neighbourhood policy was modelled on the success of enlargement, and that means it privileged, or at least initially privileged, individual merit-based approach. And that means EU was cooperating with countries on a bilateral basis, even though that came at the expense of regional promotion of regional cooperation. That was understood as one of the weaknesses, and EU tried to remedy it by conceiving the so-called Black Sea Synergy. It was the first geographic regional initiative that brought under one umbrella all Black Sea countries. In a way, it attempts to encourage and promote regional cooperation in different sectors, such as transport, energy. But we are yet to see the results because the policy came to effect only last year, so we're yet to see the results that it produces. Another issue that could be highlighted is that as EU engages more and more in the region, there is risk of overlap, be that geographic or functional, with other regional organizations and actors, especially the OSCE and BISEC. I mean, last week I attended a conference in Berlin, and BISEC, Black Sea Economic Cooperation Organization, expressed their serious concerns about mushrooming EU initiatives. They felt that these initiatives undermined EU's, not EU's, but the regional initiatives which were already there on the ground, because the countries are competing for what they felt the bigger prize, like EU membership, and as a result, they were more keen to be engaged with the EU than cooperating amongst themselves. So one of the issues for the EU would be to make sure that whenever the new initiative is promoted, that they do create some synergies with the already existing initiatives and especially regional actors on the ground. Now, the more EU engages with the region, the more there is a risk that that may also accentuate further kind of cleavages or even tensions with Russia. Because Russia sees this area as falling within its sphere of interest, especially when we talk about the resolution of so-called frozen conflicts. Another area I want to highlight, the very idea behind the European Neighbourhood Policy, which in a way in EU's parlance that means Black Sea cooperation minus Belarus, was to promote a coherent policy towards the region. Yet, one clearly sees that there are some diverging national priorities, and there is the so-called Southeast debate. Whenever we talk about the Mediterranean Union, that is very likely to fuel additional debates about what kind of engagement EU needs to project towards its eastern partners. There is a new initiative, a Polish-Swedish initiative, which will be discussed by EU foreign ministers next week. So, there are ideas. If one is trying to promote, for example, the Mediterranean dialogue, then, of course, the eastern members of the European Union try to see and to make sure that it's balanced off by a stronger engagement into the east. Energy happens to fall also within this category. In a way, no one questions the need for the EU to diversify its energy sources as well as transport routes. I mean, everybody recognizes the strategic role of the Black Sea in this area. At the same time, EU is yet to agree on the energy policy at the level of 27. I mean, that means how to exactly to reduce its dependence on Russia. And my last comment would be about the growing expectations credibility gap. The Black Sea region presents quite a challenge for the European Union. I mean, in a way, the EU branded itself as a kind of different type of international actor, as normative power. So where else can it translate its vision, if not in its immediate neighborhood? And Black Sea is one of the areas, especially when it comes to the frozen conflict. I mean, failure to translate this vision into reality may lead to the loss of credibility. So for the EU, there is quite a bit of pressure to perform and deliver. And with that, I conclude.
Thank you very much, Marasa. The first half of our panel offered a historical analysis of Black Sea political developments spanning several centuries and a broader look at EU priorities. Now we'll take a look at the two major Black Sea powers, Russia and Turkey. And our third panelist to discuss Russia in the Black Sea Basin is Ariel Cohen with the Heritage Foundation, where he serves as Senior Research Fellow for Russian and Eurasian Studies and International Energy Security, and is also the author of Russian Imperialism, Development and Crisis, and Eurasia in the Balance. Pleasure to have you here, Ariel.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me. I'm glad to see some familiar faces and looking forward for particularly John Roberts' presentation later on. When I started looking at the Russian sources and to understand the narrative, the contemporary Russian narrative about the Black Sea, I was impressed by the historic roots, by anchoring the analysis and the discussion in the 200-plus years of Russian history at the Black Sea, and not, and the lacking of discussion of sort of new multilateral, cooperative, 21st century soft power discussion. The Russian narrative in the Black Sea starts with Peter the Great, the siege of Azov in 1696, the first defeat of the Turks, and then second, third, fifth, tenth, etc. If I remember correctly, the Russians started fighting the Turk on the Black Sea, on the Sea of Azov, and then on the Black Sea in the second half of the 17th century, and then proceeded until World War I, in which Russia indeed was victorious on the Turkish front, on the Ottoman front. So the historic narrative focuses on building the naval power in the Russian naval power in the Black Sea, establishing the naval port in Sevastopol, and colonizing the steppe of what's today southern Ukraine. And there's also a very interesting interaction between the Russian focus on the Crimea and the expansion of Russian presence in the Caucasus. I have not seen written much about that, but they view the Crimea as the anchor, as a strategic asset that is important to control if you want to control the Black Sea. And then first, 1783, Catherine the Great annexes the Crimea and appoints a pro-Russian Khan in Bakhchisarai, the then capital of the Crimea, and then annexes it to the Russian Empire, sends her lover and favorite, Prince Potemkin, as in Potemkin village, to supervise the construction of the Black Sea Fleet, which was nothing to do with the Potemkin village. This was a real navy that beat the Turks again and again. The only time the Russian naval expansion was stopped was in the middle of the 19th century, when the combined squadron and force of the Brits and the French, assisted by the Turks, landed in the Crimea and took Sevastopol. Before that, importantly enough, as the Russians defeat the Turks and build the naval assets in the Black Sea, what follows is the Russian expansion into the Mediterranean. In the late 18th century, Russia aligns itself with Britain to fight Napoleon. So immediately it becomes a European player all the way to the west, taking the Corfu, landing the Marines in Italy, and the rest, as they say, is history. Why I am focusing on that so much, you may ask? Because you cannot understand Russian policy without knowing Russian history, and more importantly, knowing the Russian historiography. How many times we heard Mr. Putin and others approvingly repeating, I believe it was Alexander III talking to his heir, Nicholas II, referring to the two allies of the Russian Empire, the Russian Army and the Russian Navy. Well, gee, they didn't have the Air Force then otherwise it would be three allies. Today, the theater of operations is, of course, in Abkhazia. We've seen Russia shooting down the Georgian UAVs, pouring peacekeeping troops into Abkhazia, and in the longer term, exercising the North Caucasus military district in taking Georgia. So the activities in Abkhazia are aimed at putting a lot of pressure on Georgia. And if enough pressure is put on Georgia, then the question will face the top-level national policymakers in Washington and in Europe. What are we going to do if Russia puts so much pressure on Georgia that Georgian future is at stake? And I do not have an answer to that. This is way beyond my pay grade. Secondly, Russia now put Ukraine into play. And this is very important. There was very little reaction to what happened in the Bucharest summit, NATO summit, when Mr. Putin, in a conversation with Mr. Bush, said, sort of in a state of agitation, quote, "Do you understand, George, that Ukraine is not even a state," unquote, and if NATO expands to its borders and Ukraine and Georgia joins, Russia will, quote, "take appropriate countermeasures," up to and including Putin's reference to dismemberment of Ukraine. They were talking about the lack of legality of the 1954 giving of the Crimea by Nikita Khrushchev to Ukraine, and also apparently the eastern Ukraine, which is Russian-speaking, may be in play. Very little response. First of all, the Ukrainian response, and that's where you have to start. The Ukrainian response was quite muted, but more importantly, the European and American response, I did not find anything of particular importance in the reaction of that. And in case you thought that this was an Putin getting, letting his emotions fly, we've seen Mayor of Moscow, Mr. Lushkov, repeating the issue of Sevastopol being in the Russian hands forever and ever. And he made it on the celebration, during the celebration of the 225th anniversary of the creation of the Black Sea Fleet. He said that the city of Sevastopol, as opposed to the naval base, should revert to Russian sovereignty. And there was not only acquiescence, but in fact confirmation by the Russian Foreign Ministry that Lushkov spoke the truth from the Russian point of view. Then Lushkov was banned by the Ukrainians. There was a tit for tat. The Russians banned visits by some Ukrainian policymakers. Furthermore, Lushkov said something about recognition of Abkhazia. Then the Georgians banned Lushkov from visiting Georgia. So you can see this is not soft power, let's all hang together, 21st century diplomacy. This is, to me, more like a pre-World War II style rhetoric and diplomacy. And just to put in perspective, revisions of borders and using the co-ethnics for foreign policy purposes in Europe brings a very, very heavy baggage with it. It is true that the majority of the population of Ukraine today does not support Ukrainian membership in NATO. It is also true that the majority of the Russian-speaking population of the Crimea probably under the right circumstances would be happy to reunite with Mother Russia. After all, this is a population that was brought to the Crimea after World War II, after the ethnic cleansing of the Crimean Tatars. So today Crimea has the issue between the Russian speakers and the Tatars, ethnic conflict that is brewing, low level intensity, but intense dislike on both sides. And Russians do have tools to boost irredentist feelings in the Crimea and lead to Crimean secession. And in case you don't believe me, look at the history of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and also please examine the appropriate legislation passed by the Duma a while back, in which the procedure for secession or recognition of adjacent territories and their joining the Russian Federation is explicitly stated. So if you have population voting in a plebiscite or referendum to secede and then votes to join the Russian Federation and then the Duma joins, the procedure is laid out there. Unfortunately, 18 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rhetoric is very much that of the reemergence of Russian great power aspirations, and the only aspect that balances that, I would say two aspects. One is the actual military weakness. What Russia deploys in the Caucasus pretty much takes what they have in the southern TVD, in the southern theater. But more importantly, Russia is interested in a modicum of stability in the Black Sea because it's pumping gas across the Black Sea through Blue Stream to Turkey. It's planning to build South Stream to the lengths of the Black Sea into Bulgaria and further. The tankers with Russian oil go from Novorossiysk to the Straits. They're going to build Burgas-Alexandroupolis pipeline, so they cannot really afford, in my view, a full-scale war in the Black Sea. But that's not to say that we won't see the Black Sea area warming up in terms of rhetoric and possibly in terms of irredentist feelings in places like the Crimea and southern Ukraine. We don't have Ukrainian and Georgian analysts here, so very quickly, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
Very quickly, please.
Very quickly. As I already mentioned, the ethnic cohesiveness in Ukraine, especially in the southern part of the language question, remain an issue. In the Crimea, there are anti-Ukrainian feelings among the Russian-speaking population, the friction with the Tatars. And generally in Ukraine, you see again and again poor governance undermining Ukrainian foreign policy and Ukrainian sovereignty, bickering between the president, the prime minister, the head of the opposition, etc., and the split in attitude towards NATO. As far as Georgia is concerned, Georgia is interested in security of its ports, not just for itself, but because Georgian ports serve as entrepots for Azerbaijan and Armenia. Georgia never was a naval or a large maritime player in the Black Sea, but the Black Sea is, of course, the window to the world for Georgia. And Georgian aspirations, again, to join NATO, if anything, may provoke Russia to assert itself in the Black Sea area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ariel. And our final speaker for this panel is Dr. Ian O. Lesser. Ian Lesser is Senior Transatlantic Fellow with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And I'm proud to say was a colleague of ours here at the Southeast Europe Project several years ago when he completed a major 18-month research project on re-examining the future of U.S.-Turkish strategic relations. Here to discuss Turkey as a strategic actor, Dr. Lesser.
John, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Not long ago, you passed me a note that said, 2 minutes, please. I meant to keep going over to the other side of me. But so anyway, with that, I'm going to take that as a hint, though, to be relatively brief, because I'm sure you want some time for discussion at the end of this. And in fact, a number of the points that I would make about Turkey and its role in the region have in some ways obliquely already been made, or even directly. Charles King started out by saying that there were, in fact, real limits to what Turkey could do in practical terms, has done in practical terms, and I would very much agree with that. I also think in some important ways the overall theme of this conference tells a bit of a story about how to see Turkey, because in fact I think the interesting issues are not so much about what Turkey does in the region in a narrow sense, although we could discuss some of those, but how Turkey is a conduit, Turkey is an actor, bringing larger strategic issues to bear on the region as a whole. There are things, I'll give you just one example, I'm not actually going to talk about this, but the issue of Iranian nuclear proliferation, which is quite distant from our center of discussion here. One could imagine that and other things having a series of cascading effects where Turkey is in a way a kind of prism through which others will be affected as far away as the Aegean and beyond. Just as an example, let me make 3 quick points to you. The first about the region, the second about Turkey, and the third about what it might mean for U.S. and European policy. The first point I'd make is that you can look at this from 2 perspectives for Turkey. One is how the Turks see the region. The other is how others see Turkey as an actor in the region. And that becomes quite important because a lot of the Western debate about why Turkey matters includes the Black Sea, among other places, as areas where Turkey is of geopolitical significance: the Balkans, the Black Sea, Caucasus, Central Asia, and Middle East, and so on. So it's partly about how we describe Turkey. In terms of Turkey's own interests, well, the first point I think to make, and it's very important, is that there is a multipolarity debate that has gone on in Turkey as elsewhere. But from a Turkish perspective, and it's true, I think, this is a kind of classically multipolar region, in fact, increasingly multipolar. We've had a discussion of some of the influences already, but they're growing. So Turkey looks out on this region, on the Black Sea, and sees lots of actors playing different kinds of roles. It is not in any sense, if it ever was, something dominated by a U.S. or a Russian role. It's multipolar. The economy matters a lot for Turkey in this region. In different respects, there is really a lobby in Turkey now that focuses on Turkey's economic stake in this region. There will be further discussion, I know, about the energy dimension, but Turkey does not have a monolithic debate about energy or about who should be the appropriate energy partners for Turkey. There are different commercial interests, different political interests in Turkey who favor different kinds of routes and different kinds of projects. It is a very lively debate about energy security. Russia has become a leading, maybe the leading, depending upon how you measure it, trade and investment partner for Turkey. Europe as a whole is a bigger actor in the wider sense, but as an individual state, Russia is probably number 1 in terms of, if you include energy trade. Security. There are many ways to look at this. I would say on the whole that Turkey's security interests in the region are relatively diffuse. Turkey doesn't have a strong sense of threat emanating from the Black Sea. But there is behind much Turkish thinking about the region this historic sensitivity to the competition with Russia and other issues that are not far below the surface. It's true there has been this historic détente between Russia and Turkey over the last decades, since the end of the Cold War, and that's driven largely by economic interests. How long will it last? I think that we'll get to that in a second. But I think it may be influenced by who is running Turkish foreign policy over the next few years. Final point about affinity. The German Marshall Fund has a survey called Transatlantic Trends, and it measures among other things, the warmth of feeling of different countries on both sides of the Atlantic towards others. And the list of countries changes from year to year, but one of the things that is very clear is that Turks as a whole are rather cool towards others in general. But one of the few countries that actually makes it into a certain degree of warmth with Turkey is Azerbaijan. There was a strong sense of affinity from the Turkish public with Azerbaijan. Some of the Turkish elite traces its sort of biographical identity back to the Caucasus. So at a certain level of affinity, which matters in Turkish foreign policy increasingly, because public opinion counts in Turkey in foreign policy terms these days, the Black Sea, and especially Azerbaijan, looms fairly large. Let me just say something about Turkey and what's happening there very briefly. We could have a whole conference on this, but Turkey is in a state of political turmoil at the moment for reasons that most of you will know. My own view is that probably the ruling AKP party will be closed. That key political personalities, including the prime minister, will be banned. Some of them may be prosecuted. Others may be prosecuted. In any case, I think Turkey, without going into detail, is headed for a period of some considerable political and economic turmoil. Just on the economic side, to give you just a sense of this already, the court case is expected to come to some conclusion sometime over the next months. Already, the Turkish stock market has declined by 30%, just in anticipation of what might happen. This has no end of foreign policy consequences, which we could talk about. It will severely complicate Turkey's already troubled European Union candidacy, which may become hollow or stall or, in fact, be put on hold entirely by the European Union as a result of this. It will also, in a more direct sense, for our discussion, I think, further constrain what Turkey can do in this region. Whether it's in terms of security initiatives or new energy initiatives, multilateral activity of all kinds. Turkey will remain a partner in these things. The question is, how much of a leadership role is Turkey going to be willing to play? And I think if there have been limits so far over the last decade, those limits are likely to increase if Turkey's energies are going into dealing with an internal crisis. Turkey has had a new look in its foreign policy over the last number of years. Under AKP, strategic depth, zero problems with neighbors. The Black Sea has been part of this, along with the Balkans and the Middle East. If AKP is closed, if we have a new political constellation in Turkey, one possibility, I think it's likely, is that foreign policy will be run again by traditional security elites in Turkey. The military and others will come to the fore again, not just on special security issues like northern Iraq, but on broader issues like management of security relations in the Balkans and the Black Sea. I think that is going to further constrain new things that Turkey can do. Final point, third point, about what this might mean for the West, if I can use that term, for the United States and for Europe. I think this is going to become a more complicated area in terms of Turkish-Western relations. First of all, because I believe Turkish-Western relations are going to become more complicated. So that's my starting point. But if we're looking to Turkey to play a positive role in the Black Sea, where I think Turkey is inclined to do that. I mean, if we adopt, Ariel, your kind of typology, of status quo versus more revolutionary or interventionist actors, Turkey is clearly a status quo player. But how activist will it be? How easy will it be to deal with Turkey in detail? I think less activism, more sovereignty consciousness, a more difficult partner in some ways for the EU and Turkey. Now, as the European Union proceeds with its neighbourhood policy, with perhaps successive waves of enlargement, this is obviously going to put even more pressure on the question of what the European Union does with Turkey, and vice versa. I believe the candidacy is deeply troubled. I believe it's headed probably for more trouble. But all of that, I think, will appear in much sharper and starker terms if there are new enlargements in the Black Sea space and Turkey is left out. There is also a question about Russia in the West. If we are headed for a more competitive, more difficult relationship as a whole between Russia and the West, this time around, Turkey is going to be front and center geopolitically in terms of the space. It's not going to be a question of competition in the center of Europe or on the inner-German border. This is going to be in the Black Sea. And Turkey is going to be at the center of that. Turkey will be torn. Turkey will have its strategic interest in strong security ties to the West to reinsure itself against this historic concern about Russia as a geopolitical competitor. On the other hand, it will have very strong economic interests in doing other things. Let me just conclude then by saying that I think what we have seen is Turkey as a status quo actor, Turkey as a potentially extremely significant actor in this region, the region itself playing a rather central role at points in Turkey's own foreign policy debate, but in fact, on the ground or on the sea, much less activism, much less leadership than one might have imagined a decade ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. And we will open up this panel for questions, but what I would like to do first is take some of the central points highlighted by two of my colleagues here and see if I can frame an opening question. And I'm going to direct the question towards Rasa and towards Ariel, and then if Charles and Ian would like to respond, please do. And then let's open it up for discussion. Rasa, you raised several critical issues regarding increasing EU energy dependence on Russia, the difficulty you cited in occasionally for the EU in coordinating its policies with, I don't want to call them minor, but certainly not at the level of NATO, institutions such as the Black Sea Economic Cooperation, the OSCE, and there is this ongoing problem now inside of Europe with Kosovo, that the EU and NATO don't seem to have coordinated very effectively, at least as it deals with coordinating the eventual EU and NATO accession or enlargement of all of the other Balkan countries. So we have that history and those current developments in place. But then, Ariel, you focus on some of the continuing problems between Russia and the West, if I can use that phrase, Ian, as it pertains to Ukraine. And I think it's in 2017 that the issue of the Russian fleet in Sevastopol comes to a head. And the Ukrainians, at least right now, indicate they do not want a Russian fleet in Sevastopol in 2017. And if I heard you correctly, the Russians stated that there will be a Russian naval fleet in Sevastopol in Ukraine in 2017 and beyond. So if I can ask the two of you maybe to bring some of your perspectives to this issue. And again, going back to the title of the conference on transatlantic perspectives, can the EU and NATO work together on issues such as a potential crisis in Ukraine, given the recent history in a problem like Kosovo?
Coordination is not a rocket science, but at the same time it does take quite a bit of time and energy. Taking into account that the EU is not a monolithic actor, number one, coordination is amongst the EU, even on Kosovo or energy. Before we go and coordinate with the United States, for example, I mean, it takes quite a while, and regarding Kosovo, we have not solved that question even internally, so before we go and coordinate with the United States. That's why I think it's quite a bit, quite problematic. Going to the Black Sea area, it becomes even more problematic because there is already, quite a clear cleavage within the European Union between the countries, the new member states and the so-called old member states, minus one or two states which shifted the ranks. Kosovo has posed quite a challenge for us, and I think, in a way, in some areas, there are ripple effects on a number of issues, and we will continue to see them.
Thank you. Ariel?
First of all, there are, in my view, maybe because I'm doing energy for a living, more pressing issues in the EU that have not produced coordination within the EU, let alone coordination with NATO. And I'm referring to the time lag that it's taking the EU to focus on Nabucco pipeline. And Nabucco, of course, would theoretically bring Caspian natural gas to the Baku-Erzurum main gas pipeline, gas from Turkmenistan, possibly Kazakhstan, possibly even Uzbekistan, bypassing Gazprom network, and then taking it to Europe. Instead, the Russians are proceeding with the South Stream by co-opting EU and NATO member Bulgaria, then Serbia, EU and NATO member Hungary, and EU member Austria to cooperate with a lot of support from the state-owned Italian company. And this is done on face-to-face, behind closed-door meetings between Mr. Putin and Mr. Berlusconi. Furthermore, I was in Brussels less than a month ago speaking to the European Parliament on Russia. And I also met my personal friends who work for NATO. And I prodded this specific question about EU-NATO policy coordination. And eyes rolled, people looked into the floor, and basically you don't have very much of that. In addition to that, while you have very good personal relations, for example, between Mr. Putin and Mr. Berlusconi, Mr. Putin and Mr. Schroeder, Mr. Putin and Mr. Sarkozy now, you do not have good personal relation between the Secretary General of NATO and Mr. Solana, and this is not a secret. So in terms of the EU, qua EU, I think we're better off talking to the European capitals, just like the Russians do that. And as one of my colleagues, a very knowledgeable Italian analyst, put it, Russia is today the second most influential country in Western Europe after the United States. In terms of Turkey, if I may just a quick reply to Ian, it is really interesting how Russia and Turkey together were willing to push the European, NATO, and U.S. Efforts to push them out of the Black Sea area when such initiatives came up, either through downgrading the diplomatic representation of the Russian Federation in this multilateral fora, or boycotting them altogether. So I think at some point, and probably before Turkish internal developments started to churn and weaken Turkish foreign policy ambition, but at some point we saw a Russian-Turkish condominium with the intent to, if not to throw the U.S. and Western Europe out of the Black Sea, but at least to keep the profile of the U.S. presence and the Western European presence on the Black Sea to the minimum. Ian, won't you agree with that more or less?
Yeah, I do. I think that's correct. I mean, that was an interesting episode. The question is whether this is, and it's accurate the way you've described it. The question is whether this was an exception in terms of Turkish policy, or whether it was something that we need to understand in some broader context. I mean, absolutely. I mean, Turkey was very uncomfortable with having NATO extend Operation Active Endeavour in the Mediterranean into the Black Sea, and there have been other instances where they've kept us out of things as an observer and so forth. You know, why? I think there is something, you know, this core of sovereignty consciousness and growing nationalism, actually, in Turkish policy, is in some ways most closely felt in terms of the Kurdish issue, but also very closely felt in terms of sovereignty issues in the Black Sea and these issues of the straits and governance and so forth. And I think it touches on a issue of particular sensitivity for Turks. And this is one of the and perhaps there is a certain coincidence with Russian sensitivities in that regard, and that may explain it.
And nationalism.
And nationalism. But of course it cuts counter to a larger Turkish pattern of behavior and interest, which is to put NATO very much at the center of certain kinds of things. You can do things with Turkey in terms of power projection and security realm through NATO multilaterally that you could simply not do bilaterally. This has certainly been the American experience with Turkey in a number of different realms. And finally, of course, on this issue of Turkey, of EU-NATO coordination, Turkey is a player in this, because Turkey is, in fact, an obstacle in this. Leaving aside the merits of the Turkish case, that's a separate debate we could have. In various ways, in different fora, Turkey is holding this up. They're not the only ones, but it is one of the factors, for reasons Cyprus and other things we could talk about.
Right. Thank you, Ian. All right, we will open this up for questions. I've got a couple of hands up, and please, we'll ask you to identify yourselves by name and by professional affiliation. The gentleman there on the right, please, and we'll come to you, sir.
Stanley Cobra with the Cato Institute. When the Cold War ended, there were these questions of identity that emerged. Which side of the line are you on? NATO and EU membership defined whether European or not. The question of alignment came up. It's not just this issue of strategy or economics, so that plays into it. Where do you fall? And I was struck reading an article this morning regarding Turkey. Quotes unidentified Turkish general as saying, if we had been a member of the Warsaw Pact and not NATO, we would be in the EU by now. That's bitter. And the question here is there a sense of betrayal? Because the implication, as I read it, was, you think we don't have any other options. We have other options. We can get closer to Iran. We can get closer to Russia. If you don't, if you say we do not belong to Europe, we have other options.
Is your question directed at Ian, perhaps, or anyone?
If anybody else.
Anyone want to crack at them?
Ian.
Well, I mean, I'll just say something very briefly. I mean, it's a very telling quote that you mentioned, and I would interpret it the way you do, which is to say there is an issue of identity, which is very strongly felt in Turkey, and this hollowness of the EU candidacy, hollowness of the EU project, its open-ended nature, has disappointed a lot of Turks. And you get comments like this. I would somewhat turn it around and say that if Turkey was a Christian country of 15 or 20 million people, rather than a essentially Muslim country of 80 million by the time Turkey might come in, then they probably also would be in the EU by now. I mean, I think it was less a question of sort of being on the wrong side of the historical divide geostrategically than these issues of identity, which you started out when and I think that's quite right. I think we can sometimes push these issues of identity and affinity and so on to the side and talk just about strategic real estate, and that leaves some very important issues out of the debate.
Ariel, want to comment?
Actually, on the same trip I went to Brussels, I also went to Istanbul, and the take-home is that the secular elite that is now pushing for banning of the AK Party, and for which the EU project was such a high priority, because culturally these people are European. The Turkish secular elite culturally is European. But that secular elite is very much in minority and on defense and feeling very insecure. So paradoxically, if they now push with the banning of the AK Party, they shoot themselves in the foot, if not to say in the head, because that further delays, if not sidetracks altogether, their chances of joining the EU. With respect to the general's quote that you quoted, I think the general, with all due respect, is off, because we have a large country which was not only in the West, in the Warsaw Pact, was part of the Soviet Union. That's Ukraine. And the European Union is not willing to consider the Ukrainian candidacy, just as they're not really interested in getting Turkey in. This is because there is the enlargement fatigue, and this is because a lot of the European elite came to the conclusion that after the defeat of the referenda in France and the Netherlands, they first need to take care of their home affairs, if you want, through the Lisbon Treaty or otherwise, before they undertake any major enlargements such as Turkey or Ukraine.
Thank you. We have the gentleman there, and then we'll have the microphone come up here.
Thank you. Is that on?
Yes.
My name's Ron Linden from the University of Pittsburgh. I just returned from Georgia and Ukraine, where I was lecturing on behalf of the State Department on NATO. The question I got in Georgia was why NATO wasn't standing up to Russia. The question I got in Ukraine was why NATO was trying to provoke a war with Russia. So it goes to the point of diversity in the region. But my questions, I have two, are really both directed at to Mr. Cohen. One, you mentioned the NATO summit and Putin's statement. What do you make of the NATO rather unprecedented promise that both Ukraine and Georgia would ultimately become members of NATO, a promise never extended before, even to countries that got the MAP program? And second, the broader question here, I'm going to not let you duck the policy issue. Is this, Abkhazia in particular and Georgia, is this, to quote Chamberlain, a faraway place about which we care little, and therefore we shouldn't put an already overextended NATO and the U.S. in harm's way? Or should we do something on the grounds that it is or might be a repeat of the pre-World War II experience?
On the first question, okay, I'm sorry, what was the first question again?
Well, the promise made at the Bucharest
summit.
Summit.
My reading of open sources is that the promise was that of the membership action plan. It was not the promise of membership per se. If my colleagues saw something different, I would encourage them to jump in. Secondly, my sources, such as they are telling me that Germany is going to oppose the membership action plan in December, regardless of what President Bush is going to say. And having been to Brussels, as I mentioned several weeks ago, I haven't met one German member of the European Parliament who had one word, one syllable bad to say about anything Russia is doing, be it democracy, human rights, the Caucasus, or you name it. Money talks, and a lot of money talks a lot. With Germany being the main flag bearer for the new Ostpolitik, I don't see the immediate move to have Ukraine or Georgia in NATO. I also see Russia quite deliberately escalating these crises, be it Abkhazia, South Ossetia, the Crimea, the Sevastopol, or what have you, in order to raise the din of conflict or rhetoric to a degree in which the Europeans will be very uncomfortable accepting Russia and, Ukraine and Georgia. Moreover, I do think that whoever is elected in our presidential elections in November will undertake a major reassessment of U.S. foreign policy, including the relations with Russia. And at which point, I am not sure, especially if an administration that emphasizes diplomacy, and I won't say more, comes to power. I'm not sure how the NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia would survive, nor I'm sure with regards to the future of our deployment of missile defense in Poland and the Czech Republic. As far as your question about Abkhazia, again, it depends what kind of administration you have. You may have an administration that is not interested in any kind of new escalation. Even with the rhetoric on Iran of one of the candidates, where looking down the pike, at least with that campaign, going in the direction of an attempt, and I personally am not very optimistic, but an attempt of negotiating one of the most difficult current questions of American foreign policy. So I do not see the United States risking a major confrontation. And by major confrontation, I mean the stuff that you and I teach or have taught, the Cuban Missile Crisis, over a place like Abkhazia. I just don't see it happening.
All right. Thank you, Ariel. Charles, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I'd be interested, Ron, and during the discussion period later, we can compare notes on your recent trip. I'm very interested to hear what you found there. Just on the Abkhaz question, though, it seems to me that Russia in Abkhazia and more broadly around the Black Sea has been a fundamental status quo power, if you think of the status quo sort of circa 1994, 1995. That is to say, the nature of strategic relationships around the Black Sea, the unrecognized states, frozen conflicts, whatever one wants to call them, suited Russian interests just fine. All of the wars of the Soviet succession that Russia had some hand in were won by the secessionist powers. Transnistria won the war. Abkhazia won the war. South Ossetia won. Nagorno-Karabakh won. And a situation in which those de facto states could continue building some degree of sovereignty, in which Russia had played a role there, in which they weakened the recognized states, in which Russia could be part of some kind of international negotiating forum via the OSCE or the United Nations that kept going but never really went anywhere. All of that, I think, suited Russia just fine. This context, though, of 2008 is not the context of 1994, 1995. There is the precedent of Kosovo, which is powerful and real, I think. There is the commitment of the alliance to expand and the very strong position of the United States in that regard. There is the Olympics in 2014. I mean, the attention of the European Union to the Black Sea zone. Everything has begun to change, not, it seems to me, because Russia itself desired it to change necessarily, but because lots of, as they used to say in the old days, objective factors began to shift around the sea, and Russia has responded in terms of its national interests appropriately. I very much agree with Ariel's point about the United States not wishing to make Abkhazia, another Cuban Missile Crisis, the kind of thing that would cause a major confrontation between regional or global powers. On the other hand, that's perhaps the most dangerous issue in the region, because the Georgians, I think, understand that. The Azerbaijanis understand that with respect to Karabakh. And there is therefore a built-in incentive for the Georgians or the Azerbaijanis constantly to keep these issues alive. Otherwise, they will slip off the table.
Charles, if I may say, Armenians are doing a pretty good job keeping it alive as well.
Yeah, indeed. Although, in that instance, though, you have, it's who is satisfied by the current status quo and who seeks to change the status quo, it seems to me.
I'm going to apologize to everyone else here who has a question, but we've run out of time for this panel. But I want to thank very much all of our panelists for their superb and responsibly provocative presentations. We're going to go into our second panel momentarily in energy and economics, but I would ask all of you to please join me in a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you all.